Hello and welcome back. In the last two episodes we made the starting area of the dungeon. So in this one we're going to find out what lies beyond the iron door. So the first thing we'll need for this is a large room with exits on all four sides, and while you could make a new tile for this, I'm just going to reuse the one from season 2. And admittedly, it does have the slight drawback of not having a precise grid built into the image itself, but it's easy enough to figure out where it should be. In addition to that, we'll also need to make 3 of the magic portals, like this one here, and as you can see, these are made in the exact same way as the doors, so there's no real need to go over that again. And while that's all of the terrain that's required for this next room, we'll also need some small elemental models. So if you've already got something like that, these old pre-painted D&D models for example, then you can skip ahead to the timestamp shown on the screen. However, if you don't, or would just like to have a go at making your own, then, well, keep watching I suppose. Right then, as you can see, for this first one I've taped some greaseproof paper, or parchment paper I think it's sometimes called, to my cutting mat. And I'll also mention that the grid lines on my own mat, they're 1 centimetre or 10mm apart, and I'll be using that as a guide for most of these pieces. Anyway, to begin with, I'll first make a circle of hot glue around 2 centimetres in diameter, and you can try to give it a bit of a swirling texture at this point if you like, but mine just tends to merge all together at this stage. Next, while that's setting, I'll take a toothpick and cut off one of the pointed ends, and then just coat around 1 inch of that in hot glue. And again, you can try to add a bit of a swirl, but it might not be that visible when it's dry. But yeah, I'll then make a smaller circle of hot glue, maybe around 1 centimetre in diameter, and stick this toothpick piece on top. And it actually looks a bit better in the end if you glue it on at a slight angle. Okay, so when that's all set, I should then be able to peel this last piece off the paper, and that should now look something like this. Then if I take the glue gun again, I can add a spiral to the top of the larger circle, and then bulk out the toothpick some more with more hot glue. And this time I am trying to get a bit of a spiral pattern by leaving slight gaps between the swirls, and by kind of sculpting the shape of the glue with the nozzle of the glue gun, and I am also trying to make the whole thing a bit more cone shaped. Then I'll just stick that to the top of the large circle and wait for that to set. And when it has set, if I peel it off the paper, you can see that it's starting to take shape. So if I just quickly get rid of the paper and any little wisps of glue, the next thing I'm going to do is add a final couple of swirls around the toothpick section, and I'll also add a spiral to the flat side of the larger circle. So something like this. And when that's fully hardened up, this is how it should look. And you could leave it like that if you like, but I'm going to add a bit of paint. So for this part, I'm just using some army paint and matte white, and all I'm going to do is dry brush that all over the miniature. But if you're not familiar with the dry brushing technique, then it's basically where you put a small amount of paint on the end of an old brush, or maybe a dedicated dry brush, and then wipe as much of that off as possible on an old cloth or similar. I actually like to use bits of an old t-shirt for this rather than a paper towel. And then, if you imagine that you've pulled a delicate ornament off the shelf for example, and are then using a brush to lightly dust away all the dust, that's the kind of back and forth motion that I'm using here, all over the model. And if you do that, the paint should only catch on the raised edges. So in this example, that's most of the swirls that I've added with the glue gun. So there you go, that's the kind of effect I'm going for with this piece. As far as painting goes, nothing too complicated. Anyway, all I'm going to do now is cut the end of the toothpick away, and in the PDF you'll notice that I've also included textures for 4 small bases, and all I've done with this one is glued it to some card and cut it to size. Then it's just a matter of adding a spot of hot glue to the bottom of the piece and sticking that to the top of the base. And that should end up looking something like this. So it's not anything special, just a mini tornado looking thing, but it'll be more than good enough for what we'll be using it for. Okay then, for this next piece we're going to need some small stones, or like I've got here, some cheap fish tank gravel. And over on the right, you can see that I've sorted out a few bits that I think will work for creating a vague humanoid shape. So starting at the bottom, there's a couple of small pieces that I'll stack on top of each other for where the legs would be. Then there's a larger, flatter piece which will work for the kind of hip area. Next, there's a large piece for the main torso, and a little head-shaped stone to go on top. I've also sorted out a few bits that should work for the shoulders and the arms, but I'll not worry too much about those for now. Anyway, all I'm going to do is hot glue the 5 main pieces that I just mentioned on top of each other. And, as you'll see, I'll usually dry fit them first to see which orientation works best, as I do want the figure to be standing reasonably upright. I don't want it to be leaning off to one side too much. Anyway, here's the head going on now, and I'll then glue on one of the shoulder pieces, and a longer, thinner piece for the arm itself. And then I'll do the same thing on the other side, though in this instance I did have to rummage through the gravel again to find a piece that was a better fit. Then I can glue the whole thing to the top of an empty glue stick, which I'll be using as a makeshift painting handle. So yeah, there you go. That's the kind of thing that I was aiming for. Just a little humanoid shape. Okay then, for the paint scheme, I'm first going to use some brush-on primer. Again, from the Army Painter. Actually, all the paints I'm going to use in this tutorial, they're all from the Army Painter, so that'll save me repeating myself later on. Then, once that's dry, I'm going to make a wash of equal parts strong tone and quick shade mixing medium, and then, as you can see, I'll just slather that over the entire piece. Though, around halfway through I realised that I hadn't mixed nearly enough, so I reckon 3 or 4 drops of each, that's probably about as much as you're going to need for a piece this size. And yeah, as I say, I'll cover the entire thing, so that when it's dry, it ends up looking something like this. And you could leave it there if you like, but I'm going to do a light dry brush over the top with a skeleton bone paint. So here I am doing just that. It's pretty much the same kind of thing as I did before. And when that's done, here's how it should look. That's the level of dry brushing that I'm going for with this one. So I'll just carefully break that off the handle off screen. There you go. And all that's left to do then is glue it to a base, which is what you can see me doing here. And there you go. There's a little earth elemental creature. And I think it's turned out pretty nice. Okay, for this next one, I'll be taking a stick of hot glue, and I'll cut the one end into a point, like you can see here. Then it's just a matter of building up that point with more glue, and kind of widening it out a bit to try and get something that has the rough shape of a flame. So yeah, I like to do that a couple of times, and like before, I'm not all that concerned about getting a nice texture on the outside for the first couple of passes. It's only when I get to the 3rd or the 4th pass that I'll take a toothpick and start adding some more texture with that. And that should hopefully result in something like this. Now, from here on, I'm not really using all that much extra glue. I'm really just squeezing out small amounts and using the nozzle to add to the overall texture. Sometimes taking a toothpick again and trying to tease out little extra wisps of flame almost. So that's pretty much all I'm doing in this part of the process that you can see here. And then I'll make one more pass with the glue gun just to tie the whole thing together. And there you go, here's the finished flame. I mean, you can keep messing around with it forever if you want it to look perfect, but this looks fine as it is. Now, for the paint, I'll be using some demonic yellow, and I'll coat the entire piece in that. However, I'm not going to worry too much about getting great coverage because I think it actually works better if there's some little bits of hot glue showing through in some of the deeper recesses. Anyway, once that's dry, I'll then take some pure red and use that to dry brush the whole thing, maybe paying a bit more attention to the very top of the flames and applying a bit more paint there. And with any luck, that should result in this kind of thing. I'll then just cut most of the flame away with a sharp knife, grab myself another one of the bases, and kind of half melt, half glue the bottom of the flames onto that base, so that it ends up looking something like this, which, again, considering what it's been made from and the simple paint job it's had, it doesn't actually look too bad. Right then, for this last one, I'll be using the greaseproof paper again, and I'm going to draw a couple of lines of hot glue up and down the sheet that are roughly 4 cm long by 1 cm wide. and I want each one to be a kind of solid piece, but with a few gaps here and there. So I've sped up the part where they're drying, and if I now pull them away from the paper, you can see the kind of thing that I mean a bit better. So yeah, something like that. I'll then trim away any wisps or unsightly pieces, and then take a toothpick and use that to help me roll one of the pieces into a kind of S shape and the other into a C shape. And when doing this, I've made sure that the kind of bumpy side of the hot glue is on these sides here. And that's because I'm going to be gluing the two flat sides back to back, like you can see me doing here with this quick test assembly. So yeah, that's what I'll do next, though you do need to be quick and not use much glue, otherwise you're in danger of remelting the two strips, because, you know, they're just hot glue as well. Anyway, there you go, that's the beginnings of a basic wave shape. Though I am going to add a bit more hot glue nearer to the bottom, just to hold it in shape ready for the next stage, but again, you really need to be quick and careful because, as you might be able to see, I almost melted straight through one of the strips when doing this myself. But yeah, when that's dry, I'll then take a sharp pair of scissors and cut away some of the excess from around the bottom of the piece, so that it ends up looking something like you can see here. Now, to make this next part a bit easier, I've taken another empty glue stick and taped some greaseproof paper to the top, so that I can then make another circle of hot glue on top of that, maybe around 15mm or so in diameter, and then push the wave piece down into that. So, something like this. Okay, next I'll fill in the gaps at the sides, again being careful not to melt too much of the original strips. Then I'll bulk out the bottom half a bit more, and add a few more bumps here and there. And then, here I am filling in the holes at the front, and adding some more texture. Then, from here, I'm just adding more hot glue really, a little bit here, and letting it set, then a little bit there, and letting that set, because if you try to do too much all at once, the whole piece might melt, and you'll have to start all over again, as I've discovered. So yeah, just be patient, and take your time. So, here's the kind of thing that I've ended up with, and all I'll need to do now is remove it from the greaseproof paper, and tidy up the edges with a pair of scissors. And there you have it, there's the finished wave. So all I'm going to do now is slap on some paint, and like I did with the earth elemental, I'm just going to use an empty glue stick again as a cheap painting handle. So the main colour I'm using for this is electric blue, and just like with the fire piece, I'm not going to be too concerned about getting 100% coverage. I'm just going to give it one coat all over, and that will be more than good enough. Then, once that's had a few minutes to dry, I'm going to dry brush the whole thing with matte white, just starting off with very gentle strokes, and then adding more and more pressure until I'm happy with the amount of white that's on there. After that, it's just a matter of half gluing, half melting the bottom of the wave to another of those bases, just like with the flames, and when that's done, here's how it should look. Which, again, it's not as good as a proper miniature, but it's plenty good enough for what we'll be using it for. And speaking of what we'll be using it for, it's probably about time I explain the encounter for the next room. Okay, so, if you remember, at the end of the last episode, I said that the characters could end up with 4 keys in their possession, one for each elemental type, and I also said that there were only 3 keyholes in the iron door at the end of the corridor. Now, if they examine the keys in more detail, apart from them being made from different materials, they all seem to be the exact same shape. So, it doesn't really matter which 3 keys are used, and it doesn't matter which keyhole they go into. However, the door will only open if 3 of these keys are in place, and they are all turned at the same time. And you, as the GM, should make a note of which 3 keys have been used, as this is going to determine the type of monsters that appear in the next room. So, once the door is opened, the PCs will discover a large square chamber with a strange magical portal in the centre of the other 3 walls. And a second or two later, a small elemental guardian will step out of each. And, like I just said, the type of elemental will depend upon the type of keys that were used to unlock the door. So, if for example the earth, fire and water keys were used, then a small earth creature will step out of one of the portals, a fire creature will step out of another, and a water creature out of the third. Which, as you can see, that's how I've set things up here on the screen. But yeah, again, as the GM, you should make a note of which creature steps out of which portal, as that's also going to influence what happens in the next room. But for now, the PCs will simply have to battle these 3 elemental guardians if they want to progress further. It's it's a fairly straightforward combat encounter. And as far as stats go, you could use whatever you think is appropriate for your own party, though now is probably a good time to say that I am writing this adventure up as I go along, and I've included some simple stats for these creatures in that document, and you can find a link to that in the description if you're interested. Anyway, at some point, either after or perhaps even during the combat, the players are likely to investigate the portals, and as soon as one of these is interacted with, a PC throws something through one of them, or pokes their hand or head into it, or even steps inside, then the other two portals deactivate and turn to solid stone. In other words, aside from the iron door, there will only be one other exit from this room. And, as I mentioned earlier, you'll need to make a note of which elemental creature emerges from which portal, as the portal that the PCs will eventually have to step through, that will lead to a room of a similar type. But we'll discuss that in more detail in the next episode. So yeah, as you can see, it's the players themselves that are kind of determining what challenges they'll face next, as whatever choice they make in one room, that's influencing the kind of encounter they'll face in the next one, if that makes sense. But yeah, that's it for this one. There's still 2 more episodes to go before this level is complete, so with any luck, I'll see you again in episode 4. So, thanks for watching, and bye for now.